Mortimer, you're a smart guy. Why does it take you so long to read?
Well, it sometimes takes me long and sometimes a short time to read a book. I can read 10 books in one day in the sense of inspecting them, finding out what they're about and putting them on my shelf for future reference.
And deciding whether you want to read them or not.
Carefully or not. But just as I can read 10 books in one day, sometimes it takes me 10 days to read one book, or even longer than 10 days, because I'm really working at it. I'm trying to make that book part of myself. I'm trying to find out everything it says and understand everything it means and think about and criticize what I've learned from it. And when I do that, I'm working. I'm not just sitting back in a chair idly. I'm not about to go to sleep. I usually read books that way at my desk with a pad and paper, always with seldom without a pen or pencil in my hand. And often I find that at the end of an hour or two I have to stop because I'm so, in a sense, weary of the work that I have to take a rest before I go on reading. Mm-hmm. And what I do with a pencil in my hand, the pen, is to make notes in the book or about the book on a piece of paper. And I think that no one is really reading in the sense of getting the book into his mind if he doesn't do that. Just to sit there with the book in your hand and your eyes open, turning the pages, probably with your mind wandering, is not reading in my sense of the term reading.
What's that book there?
Well, I have here 3 books that I read carefully. These two 50 years ago, this one 40 years ago. These two I read in college when I was a student at Columbia, studying with John Dewey, and I'll tell you a story about that later. One is Reconstruction Philosophy, and the other is William James's Meaning of Truth. Both pragmatic philosophers. And this, shortly after I began teaching, I became acquainted with the great French philosopher Jacques Maritain. This is a book called Art and Scholasticism. Let me tell you, let me show you what I did in this book, for example. First place, you will see here, in my unformed childish handwriting, a series of pages of notes that I made on a pad just like that while I was reading the book.
Incidentally, by the way, before you go on, here's an example that I did that I just discovered by going through my library. It's a book about William Cooper, the man I wrote a dissertation about. I filled up the inside of the front cover with notes, but then that wasn't nearly enough, so I needed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pages, which I cut down so that they would fit inside the book.
Well, and then in the book itself, there are underlined, I put a mark in the margin to indicate that paragraph I want to call attention to, or I underlined words, and sometimes not only underlined words, but wrote down on the bottom margin of the page my own observations, my own comments on the thing, so that here at the end of the chapter is a set of notes. Now, the interesting thing about that, Charles, is that they were useful at the time. If, for example, I were to read this book now for discussion, or I would have to read it, I really want another copy. By the way, one of the reasons why I seldom use a library book, I often use library books, but when I want to do this kind of reading with them, I have to buy the book. Because I can't mark a library book, and if I don't mark a book, I don't think I've got it, you see.
Actually, when you read a book this carefully, you are establishing a proprietary right in it anyway.
You better own it.
You have brought it into your own mind, so you better own it.
But if I wanted to read this book again for the purposes of teaching it or using it in some research, I'd want another copy to mark it freshly. These earlier markings would annoy me, because though they might be helpful, I might be interested in finding out what I thought then. 50 years later, I think something different.
Well, the marks in the book are not the record, then, for you to refer back to.
No, I don't. They're not there for memory's sake. They're there because it was part of the act of reading at the time.
They do remind you of how carefully you read. I, going through my library, I found a copy of the Iliad of Homer, where I had marked almost every page. I think I made a kind of running index of the book. I was writing something about the Iliad at the time. This was 25 years ago. There was an index of this, but it was not satisfactory to me. I had to make my own index as I went along of the plot and of the characters as they acted in various ways in the book. So up at the top of many of the pages, most of the pages, I have written a description of what happens on this page. I am amazed at what I said. I no longer think it's true, But that's not the important thing. What I know is that I really read that book to a fare thee well.
That's exactly the same in this case of William James's essays on the meaning of truth. Both the front and back covers of the book are loaded with notes referring to pages, and of course the book itself is marked, underlined, asterisks. But let me say one thing about that, if I may. I, as you know, conduct these seminars at Aspen, summer after summer. I've been doing it for the last 25 years. And many of the readings are the same summer after summer, so I've read the selections that are discussed in the seminar 25 or more times. And each time I do it, I make notes. But I can't use last year's notes. I have a whole file of notes going back many, many years with the dates on them. Yeah. But each time that I conduct that seminar, I read the thing again. The selection is fairly short, 30 or 40 pages. Make another set of notes, because as I've grown older, my own mind has changed, and therefore I've got to do the reading again, the thinking again, and the note-making again to be current.
Right. Here's Walter Bagehot's Physics and Politics, and the important chapter in this book, there are 5 chapters, is the last one, and at a certain point in this chapter, Bagehot begins to give the core, the heart of his argument. And what I did here was to mark the key sentences in the argument. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and finally, one page later, 14, which is the key sentence of all. And I have that as an eternal record of the heart and meaning of this book.
Recently, reading a book that interests me considerably, written by a professor at Harvard called Reflections on the Causes of Human Misery and Upon Certain Proposals to Eliminate Them, a book dealing with current economic and social problems, I did a very elaborate marking. As you can see, in this case here, I put question marks in the margin. I often put question marks when a sentence or a statement by an author puzzles me. And in some cases, there's a great deal of underlining here, but in 1 or 2 cases, I put down, at the beginning on page 171, underlining asterisk 1, meaning that's the first point in the series of arguments, very much as you did in another case, and that goes on with asterisks and words encircled.
And you've turned down the corner of the page, haven't you?
And then there's asterisk and 2 and asterisk and 3, so that I've got a series of sentences there that I want to call my own attention to as the sequence of an argument.
Here's a copy of The Nature of the Universe by Lucretius, or On the Nature of Things, De Rerum Natura. It contains an analytical table of contents made by the translator. That is a table of contents that doesn't just give titles of chapters, but describes...
Outlines the content of chapter
outlines
by
the
chapter.
contents of the work. And it's very useful and very well done by the translator, but it's not my analytical table of contents, and I was teaching the book and working very hard on it, so I had to make my own. So I made my own analytical table of contents, which is somewhat different from the translator's, although in many respects, of course, it's the same, because I'm dealing with the same book.
Wouldn't you say that a student who is reading the book that you were teaching should do exactly the same kind of work?
That's right, and he should argue with me if his notion of what the book says is different from mine.
Reverse of that picture, that's why I never like to lend books to anybody.
Right.
I not only don't like to use library books because I can't mark them, but I don't want to lend you this book. If you want to read The Meaning of Truth, you go out and buy your own. Because I don't want you to be affected by my notes, as you would be.
Right.
You couldn't help be affected by all the markings on the page.
I might say to myself, Mortimer Adler is crazy, he has misunderstood this. Listen, what was your story about John Dewey?
Well, at about the time that I was reading this book, John Dewey had just come back from China, was teaching a course at Columbia. I was, I think, a junior or a senior. And his lectures were relatively slow tempo, so I could take in class, take down in notes almost everything he said. I'd go home and type these notes up and read them carefully and mark them. Then I'd write a letter. Dear Dr. Dewey, I would say, dear Professor Dewey, in today's lecture you said such and such, but it seems to me you were inconsistent with what you said 2 days before. Would you please explain? And Professor Dewey would come to class and say, a student in this class has written me a letter, and then he'd read the letter and explain. And then I'd go home and write another note saying, because I was carrying on a series of conversations with Dewey until he was so sometimes plagued by this, he said, I wish the student that was writing me this letter would stop. But actually what you're doing when you're marking a book is exactly that. You're carrying on a one-sided conversation with the author. In fact, I think that reading is that kind of thing.
Is that unfair? Does
no, no.
Well, how do you ensure that the author's view is adequately represented in your conversation?
You can't ensure that. But
that's your effort, isn't it? Because your first task in reading a book is to get as truly and correctly as possible what the author is saying.
Correct. But nevertheless, one of the reasons why perhaps having two people read the same book together is that they would make the conversation a little less one-sided. If I told you what I was saying to John Dewey, you could say, but I don't think Dewey says that, and the conversation would become more amplified. But you know, what all this comes to, Charles, is, I think, something that most people don't realize because they don't engage in reading in this way, that reading is a very, very active process.
Yeah.
Most people think of writing as if writing, because they can see that a person to write has to take a typewriter out of a piece. He's doing something. But they think of reading as sitting back passively and having the words somewhat go through the eyes and into the mind, and no activity. After all, you're just sitting still. But reading is just as active as writing.
Yeah.
And I often like to think of the analogy of pitching and catching in a baseball game.
The catcher who kneels down there behind the batter is not passive.
He's receiving, but not passive. He's actively receiving, just as the pitcher is actively throwing. So the writer is actively communicating, and the reader is actively receiving the communication. But the actions are correlative and proportional to one another, but the activities are equally intense on both sides.
It's a good catcher that makes a good pitcher, and I suppose we're saying here that a good reader makes a good author in some sense.
The reverse is also true. A good catcher can't catch a bad pitcher.
Yeah, yes, that's true.
And some of the rules of reading that I think we're concerned with in this making the art of reading clear apply only to books that are well written.
Yeah.
Because if the book isn't well written enough, the rules won't work. Just as a good catcher with great skill can't catch a bad pitcher.
Right.
It's
very important to emphasize this, isn't it? That we're not recommending that you take a pencil and mark a book and indicate the points in order. If it's a book you're reading just for pleasure or amusement or entertainment, or if it's a book you're just reading for information. How silly
it would be to mock a detective story.
Right, yes.
Or make notes about a detective story.
But when you're reading to elevate your understanding, when it's your mind that's involved, and when you want to really come to grips with what the author says.
Then you better make the book your own.
Right.
And you don't make it your own just by buying it.
No.
Because that's just as a piece of physical property you put on the shelf. You make it your own by putting yourself into it.
Yeah.
And you put yourself into it by marking it.